I do think it very odd that we're being called extremists and irrational and all this kind of thing, when only the other day we were being told that World War III was going to break out if we voted to leave. And really that cannot be sensible. Everybody knows that the peace in this continent is really guaranteed by NATO. And if it really is true that World War III and bubonic plague are about to break out, then why on earth are we having this referendum? This is a referendum about taking back control of £350 million a week, which we could spend according to our priorities here in this country. It's about taking back control of our borders, and I think it's about getting back control of British democracy.
It's a Europe of peace, it's a Europe of division, it's a Europe of disharmony, it's a Europe that is a recipe for resentment. And yet, faced with all this failure, both of you said the same thing today. You said Europe isn't working, so we must have more Europe, more of the same failing. Well, there is, I think, a bright star on the horizon. It's called the British referendum, and given that none of you want to concede Britain the ability to take back control of our own borders, a Brexit now looks more likely than at any point in modern time. And I hope and pray that Britain voting to leave the European Union will be the beginning of the end of a project, however noble its original intentions, has gone rotten.
Last year, in this Parliament, I asked you whether you recognised the Europe of unemployment at mass levels, of poverty at mass levels, of people dying in Greece at levels they've never known before. And you said it isn't a Europe that you recognise. It is not one that you know of. And yet now we see further on in this year, Greece emasculated, humiliated and embarrassed by your organisation and people within it. Europe on lockdown as we see the borders closing around us. And the solution you have is the six-pack and the two-pack. Well, the only two-pack I remember growing up is Tupac Shakur. And he used to, in his albums, used to have some wonderful titles for his songs. One of them was called Trapped. Another was called The Lunatic. A third was called How Long Will They Mourn Me? Well, I wonder how many of those poor, deprived, sick, injured, in this Europe that you don't recognise will mourn you when you've gone, this place when it's gone, and when the euro has gone.
Let's be clear. Of the money that we send to Brussels, £20 billion a year, £10 billion we never see again. It goes on all sorts of things. Greek tobacco farming, Spanish bullfighting. £110 million a year of CAP money goes on Spanish bullfighting, for heaven's sake. Now, with that net money back in this country, we could actually fund things like the NHS, like our science base, like our academic health science centres, even more generously than we do at present.
The UK pay their taxpayers' money. It should be going to the UK. It should be tax representation to the UK, not being distributed across the EU. I am terribly sorry if there are areas in the EU that are poor. I really am. I really am. But it should not be being funded through British taxpayers' money. We have our own issues and our own problems, and not least in the West Midlands where I come from, where people can't get in to see a doctor, they can't get into the schools they want, people are being thrown out of council houses, and here we are with British taxpayers' money being distributed across the EU. Well, I hope the projects go well for the people in the EU. I'd rather you paid for them yourself rather than taking them from the British taxpayer.
And when we have a general election that says a country like Greece wants to change direction, well, I'm sorry, but that now must be brushed aside because the Germans don't want it. And what must count as perhaps the worst piece of public policy seen in modern Europe for half a century, when you compounded the already failing and flawed EU common asylum policy by saying to the whole world, please come to Europe, and we saw, frankly, virtually a stampede. And we learn that 80% of those that are coming are not Syrian refugees. In fact, what you've done is to open the door to young, male, economic migrants, many of whom, I have to say, behave in a rather aggressive manner, quite the opposite to what you would ever expect to see from any refugee. And yet, when that failure
Fancy a dash of chlorine with your chicken? How about a side of experimental GM veggies? What about chemicals in food that can damage the development of our children? If big business has its way, these items would be on your plate right now. What stopped them so far are our regulations. And these regulations are under attack from the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, the dirtiest trade deal in Europe's history. Businesses will be able to co-write the rules. And if a business doesn't like the result, they can influence the outcome of the law. Whenever the Commission in the EU gets an idea for new rules, they will need to run them past the US government and business groups first. This is before you or your elected representatives even see what's being proposed. Business groups will even be able to make their own proposals. Who would have had the front to put ideas like this on the table? Well, they look pretty similar to a set of ideas that the US Chamber of Commerce and Business Europe have been pushing in Brussels for years. They are even planning to create a brand new body to make sure business gets its way. It will be called the Regulatory Cooperation Council. Their main priority is to protect trade. Regulatory cooperation puts profit before people and undermines key democratic principles.
But this is about fundamental issues of our constitution and whether we're able to govern ourselves and to take back control of huge amounts of money and our borders and our democracy. And just to get to the point I was trying to make, you can't vote to stay for things to stay as they are, because what will happen as soon as the British referendum is over, and if we do make the mistake of voting to stay in, they will use the institutions of the single market, the federal supranational institutions, to drive forward with a whole new agenda designed to prop up the euro, using measures to pull fiscal policy, property rights, company law. Heaven knows what the whole agenda is set out in the 5 Presidents' report. The UK will inevitably be dragged into that, and that's on top of the £600 million a week that EU regulation is costing UK business.
Okay,
Unlike the Remain side of the argument, none of us, we are not spending £9 million of taxpayers' money on this operation. I think it's absolutely infamous, by the way, that they've got the whole government, the whole of Whitehall is supporting the Remain campaign. They've got all their advisors who are being marched in the same direction. Every international visitor is made to spout the Remain campaign lines, and they're spending £9 million of taxpayers' money on shoving a leaflet through everybody's door. I think it's absolutely infamous, and never mind. We happy few, with the small amounts of money that we have at our disposal, will get our points across, and I think we've got a once-in-a-lifetime chance to change the direction of this country and of democracy in Europe.